Thank you, and thank you to the Utah Film Center for inviting me to this evening. When I got the request from an honors alum a few months ago, I thought this would just be a really fun opportunity to dive a little bit more into Mars. My area of expertise is tropical ecology, so a little far away from Mars, but it gave me the opportunity to learn a bit more and also connect with some big thinkers around Mars and folks who've been involved in the Mars missions, which was a special treat. I just wanted to start out by saying I think that this film is so very cool because it depicts the scientist as hero and the scientist as someone who's a person just like you and me, and not some kind of superhuman character that we seem to have filled with our Hollywood movies these days. And so I particularly appreciated that, and the fact that the science in the movie is quite accurate from the biological perspective. Of course, I knew that, but then when I reached out to some of my engineering friends, they told me, and I didn't know this, but the author of the novel on which this movie is based, Andrew Weir, actually published his novel in serial form on the internet, and then it was circulated around a bunch of labs like the Jet Propulsion Lab out in California and others. And so real-time scientists were doing real-time editing and corrections of his science, and then the published book incorporated all that. So most of the science that you see in the film tonight is spot on and correct based on physics and chemistry and what we know of planetary science. Perhaps the only thing that is a little bit exaggerated and must be done for fictional purposes and to make it an interesting film, I guess I'll take back what I said. Matt Damon's character is kind of a superhero. He knows much more than any one scientist would probably command. And scientists work in teams, and we do that for very good reasons. The understanding and knowledge of the world has become so specialized that it would be very difficult for someone to command physics, chemistry, biology, computer science, communication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that part of the film is kind of cool because he knows a lot. I also want to say I think it's really nice to see an actor such as Matt Damon, who's, of course, a heartthrob to some and a super action hero to others, portraying a scientist in a very methodological way, basically using the scientific method to solve his problems of life. And as a scientist myself, I get a little tired of seeing scientists depicted in popular literature or in film and TVs as those like geeky weird guys in lab coats who can't communicate with the world. And in fact, most scientists look like me, or they look like many of the people, the students who come into the Honors College, many of whom are here tonight, who are bright and interesting and curious and super talented, and they come to us already with a knowledge of kind of basic physics and chemistry, coding oftentimes. And they're also interested in solving big world problems, and they're interested in being on the edge of discovery. And they also, write poetry and play music and garden and are part of their communities. So I really appreciated that. So I was asked to talk a little bit about, could we grow plants on Mars? And so I'll just put a question out to the audience, shout out, what do plants need to grow? Soil, good. Water. Sunshine. One more. Nitrogen, phosphorus, nutrients. One more big one. Carbon dioxide, yes. So Mars is really different than Earth, and so this was no small task to figure out whether or not plants could grow. And as we're going to see in the film, there's a soil that exists on Mars, and that soil is super nutrient poor. Although there are nutrients in it, there's phosphorus, it's low in nitrogen, but the real problem of the soil on Mars is the same one that we have in the West here. The soil is very, very salty, and plants don't do well with salt, generally, particularly our agricultural plants. So that's something that's an issue that isn't quite resolved in the film. But he does something for nutrients, and we're gonna see one of his solutions is to use his own feces, which seems kind of disgusting to us. And being modern health people, we think about all the pathogens and the bacteria that would be transferred with that process. But in fact, that has been part of our way of adding nutrients to the soil for a long time. We used to call it night soil. And people would, the more wealthy folks would have the less wealthy folks emptying their chamber pots and then incorporating that into soil. So this is a practice that still happens across the world in nutrient-poor areas, and so it isn't something completely out of our idea. Water is an issue. Mars used to have a lot of water. We know that from the research that's been done. And the character, as you see, will take some rocket fuel and turn it into water. And I reached out to David O, who actually was the driver he works at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he was the driver for the Mars mission rover. I'll talk a little bit about how he engaged that at a personal level. But I thought, really? Can you make water out of rocket fuel? And in fact, he said it's completely plausible. It's very dangerous, but absolutely plausible, and that's what one would do in that circumstance. Sunlight's another problem, right? So basically the way plants make themselves, which in turn makes food for us. They don't live to make food for us, but that's a byproduct that's good for us. But they basically take CO2, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they add it to water and sunlight, and they go through this beautiful chemical process called photosynthesis, and then they produce their own sugars and their own self. Sunlight's an issue on Mars. Mars is like 1.4 times away from the sun as the Earth is, and so the further you get away from the sun, the more weak the solar energy is. So it's like being kind of up in the middle of Canada. And so the question that, again, I put to David O was, what would you do in that circumstance? Would you do artificial lights like people growing things in their basement? And he said, well, actually, that's really hard because to grow, like from solar cells to use solar cells, you taking the energy of the sun and you're converting it to electricity, and that's super inefficient, so you lose most of the energy. And then if you're converting it back into light, you would lose, again, a whole lot of energy. And so the solution, which I can't remember from the film because it's been a long time, but his solution is you would take mirrors, and you would take mirrors out in Mars, and you would essentially concentrate and harvest the sunlight into a particular space, and then you would direct that onto your plants. So definitely doable. He also talked about nuclear generators and whatnot, but that seems quite complicated and maybe dangerous in its own right. CO2. CO2 is available on Mars, but a bit different. The atmosphere is super thin compared to the Earth's atmosphere. It's about 93% CO2, right? What's our CO2 on Earth? Going up all the time, of course. 0.04%. So we don't live in a CO2 enriched atmosphere, but on Mars you would have a lot of CO2. What you don't have a lot of in Mars is oxygen. Nonetheless, what is portrayed in the movie is pretty realistic, and after the movie and before the movie, there have been a group of scientists working out of Peru. It's a very international group of scientists, and they basically have an international project to try to grow potatoes and a few other things in simulators that simulate the Mars environment. And their work came out a year or two after this film, and actually they did a pretty good job of getting very alkaline, very salty soil from the Atacama Desert in Peru, and then recreating the atmospheric conditions of the CO2, the oxygen, and then adding some water. And they had some pretty good results in growing their potatoes. And so the story there is that, yes, perhaps vegetables life could be reproduced on Mars. Of course, we have to think about scale. They were growing these things in these little tiny containers and growing a couple of potato plants and calling it good. And most of us wouldn't survive very long on a couple of potato plants. So there is an issue of scale to that. But I thought it was pretty cool that people are actually testing that on this planet right now. But the movie made me think about where we live today, because we live in this absolutely, as today attests, this gorgeous environment, the Wasatch Front, but yet we know that our population on the Wasatch Front is set to double by 2050. We don't have a lot of water resources. If you look at every single climate model that we have for the Intermountain West, it predicts that we will have less precipitation in the future. And so what I was thinking about when I was reflecting on the film is actually these sorts of films, the experiments in Peru, our lived world today gives us the opportunity to reflect on how we might not just survive, but thrive in the environments that we're living in the future. future. And I don't think that's a terribly trivial idea. One of the things that I read when I was doing research from the potato researchers is they said, oh, our work is so, as scientists, we're always trying to justify our work. We're just curious in how the plant grows. I want to grow my tomatoes in my garden and I want them to be good. But if I'm trying to write a grant, I have to have a bigger idea and I have to have something that's more interesting to the federal organizations that fund me or foundations. And so the director of the potato project in Peru said, we need to study this in Peru because Mars is a dead planet, and what if our planet dies someday? And this research that we're doing in these little cubicles is going to inform what happens to Earth in the future. And again, my email friend David O said that as a space scientist, an engineer, that he wouldn't actually call Mars a dead planet, but Mars is certainly a planet that has gone through a major climate transformation, and we don't actually understand why it's gone through that transformation. But we do know that the conditions existed on Mars in the past that would allow for at least microbial life. So we know it was warmer. We know there was more of an atmosphere. We know there was water, both running water as well as lakes. And so the idea of it being a dead planet is perhaps not true, according to him. But the idea that planets can go through radical changes in their climate is certainly something that has happened throughout our system, planetary system, and is certainly something that's happening to our planet today. And so it behooves us to really think about both those changes as well as what we might do to mitigate that. And all of this, of course, brings me back to the very beautiful part of biology, chemistry, physics aside. We live on this planet with perhaps 10 million other species, perhaps 30 million other species. We don't really know, but what we do know is that the genetic code is incredibly complex and malleable, and we as humans have used our very large brains and our opposable thumbs to kind of figure out how to manipulate the environment in ways that are really good for us in terms of our population growth, in terms of our ability to thrive in places that aren't really amenable, like the Salt Lake Valley. Our settlers who moved here, who set up agricultural, did a real feat in figuring out how to move the water and how to fertilize the Great Basin and how to create this thriving community that we have. And so when I think about the future, I think we both need to think seriously about the way we're living and the changes that are coming, both in population growth and climate change. And we also need to think in ways that are complex around our ability as a species to really take advantage of the world we live in and think and use our ingenious minds to think about ways to interact with the rest of the species on the planet, not only for our benefit, but also for the diversity of life with whom we share this planet. So I thought I would just end with something kind of fun that I learned about David O, again, this engineer that I had the opportunity to email with a bit. And when the Mars mission was going on, he and his family decided to test whether or not they could live on Mars time. So Mars days are slightly longer than Earth days, and every 3 days, it's as if you're jumping 2 time zones. So you'd go from Mountain Time to Eastern Time every 3 days. And it was in the summer, and his wife is also an MIT-trained engineer, and they decided that their entire family would live on Mars time. And so Dad went off to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he was driving the rover around essentially, and then he would come home and they had created a big spreadsheet together, and so she had the kids basically, so some days they got up at 2 a.m. because that was when Dad got home and it was morning time and they lived their day. Other days they'd have to switch it 40 minutes every few days to go, but they did this for a whole month. And one of the things that he talks and blogs about that I think is so cool is people worry about isolation of people living in space and different time zones and living on different time scenarios. And what he and his family discovered through this experiment was that, in fact, they didn't suffer any loneliness. They didn't suffer any physiological effects. They didn't suffer anything, cognitive differences that they could note, but they attributed that to that their family structure was still in place and the social interactions were still there and functional. And so that allowed them to live on this constantly shifting time zone period, which I thought was very cool because it relates to the film that we're going to see, and poor Mark, the character in this film, is left alone. So in addition to the scientific problems of survival that he's faced with, he also is completely alone. But he does choose to videotape himself, which might be a way to talk to yourself, I don't know. In any case, I'm going to stop because this is a long film, and I'm just so pleased, and thank you to the Utah Film Center for inviting me, and I look forward to watching the film with you. Thank you.